Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. U.S. National Security Advisor Herbert Raymond McMaster accused Turkey and Qatar of funding radical Islamic ideologies during a panel in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday.
National Security Advisor of the U.S. President Donald Trump, Herbert Raymond McMaster, accused Turkey and Qatar of funding extremist Islamic ideologies during a panel organized in Washington by Policy Exchange, a British think tank, on Tuesday. Radical Islamist ideology is a grave threat to all civilized people, General McMaster said. McMaster reportedly referred to Saudi Arabia's support for some of these organizations decades ago, but singled out Qatar and Turkey as main supporters at present. He also claimed that Turkey's growing problems with the West were largely a result of the rise of the AKP, Justice and Development Party, to which President Recep Tayyip Erdogan belongs. McMaster warned that Islamist radical ideology was bridging into political Islam and named the Muslim Brotherhood as an example, according to the United Arab Emirates news site The National. In Egypt, McMaster said, the Brotherhood's Mursi model monopolized the opposition, and in Turkey, AKP has consolidated power through one-party rule. In response, Ankara has slammed U.S. National Security Advisor for stating that Turkey and Qatar have become the main sponsors of extremist Islamic ideologies targeting the West. Claims by National Security Advisor McMaster, who should be well aware on how our country has been fighting terrorism and all sorts of radicalism, are non-factual, astonishing, baseless, and unacceptable, the foreign minister said in a written statement on Wednesday.
Tonight we're joined by Ahmet Yükleyen, who is an associate professor of cultural anthropology and specializes in Islamic movements. Welcome, Mr. Yükleyen.
Good to be here.
So we know that McMaster is a national security advisor in the US, but how key is his position really? Is he just any advisor?
Certainly not. First of all, the White House has these various advisors, and among them, the National Security Advisor has really has all the power to outline the national security strategy of the White House, which means the president. So there are certainly other institutions, the State Department, the Pentagon, but then when all these plans, how to coordinate all these plans, and of course the National Security Advisor has its own staff. So bringing all these options together, laying them out, and proposing it to the president for him to make decisions among them. So it's a key role. And we have to also keep in mind that I don't think it's a coincidence that McMaster, gives this talk and gives hints of what this national security strategy, which will be announced on Monday, that he talks about these issues just before that, which means that he's very much part of, laying out the main pillars of this national security strategy. So whatever he says has to be taken very seriously anywhere.
So in his speech, McMaster singled out Turkey and Qatar as the main sponsors of radical Islamist ideology, while stressing that these two have now replaced Saudi Arabia. Do you think that McMaster could be perhaps hinting at a new design for the Middle East, whereby the US, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and perhaps Israel would be standing on one axis, while Turkey, Qatar standing on another, possibly along with Iran?
Right. Of course, these terms that you mentioned, such as like new design and axis, have been used. And for the most part, I guess we could say that they haven't really been useful to understand the very complex and very challenging developments in this area in particular, because the actors are constantly shifting their alliances and allegiances. So whatever axis you've talked about the next day, you know, depending. So these actors are very much strategizing. Having said that now, there is certainly, we see these various steps that are being taken one after the other. Especially it looks like the US has been putting a strategy together to increase its own influence in the Middle East. You know, let's remember that President Trump has visited Saudi Arabia, all these close connections that they've been developing. And then, of course, Prince Salman coming up and saying that, you know, we need a more moderate, giving these moderate Islamic messages and so on and so forth. On top of which now we have this other announcement about moving the capital, the embassy, the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. So all these things do suggest that there is a larger sort of plan. And I think we will see more details of that plan on Monday. So certainly the U.S. has a plan in mind, and that's been put in action. But even as strong actors like the U.S. is in no way in control of all these unfolding events that have been happening very rapidly in this area, in the Middle East. So yes, you know, we'll be seeing shifting alliances. Will that mean a new axis or new design? A big question mark. Having said that, it looks like the U.S. wants to play a larger role in the Middle East. So we will see kind of an influence, increasing influence, at least claim to have greater influence, U.S. influence in this part of the world.
And we've observed some changes in McMaster's rhetoric since his appointment. Just a week after he was appointed, McMaster had said that he didn't agree with President Trump's use of the label radical Islamic terrorism as an effective way to actually fight against terrorism. So what has changed since then? Does the U.S. now have different definitions of security, or did McMaster somehow begin complying with the Trump administration's rhetoric?
I'm afraid nothing much has changed. I wish I have, because first of all, the very observation that he did at the time, that is avoiding the label Islamic terrorist, is certainly makes sense, because bringing the word Islam and terror together only helps those who are promoting violence as the only way for many Muslim actors to solve their problems, or the problems of the world. So certainly that's a term that has to be avoided. However, in my reading of the situation, no offense to many great, let's say, military figures and staff, but generals, that is to say, soldiers in general, tend to see issues in terms of security. So even this whole language of radical or extremist, which are the ones that he is using, is really not that different, you know, from the way of, the idea that he's avoiding Islam and terror together is maybe just one step better. But even if you look at the term that he uses, that is to say radical or extremist, in terms of our scholarly world and in terms of objective criteria as well, those are not helpful at all. So, having criticized, you know, his notions, what can be done? I think that's an important question in terms of at least finding a rhetoric, you know, labels. Many scholars would suggest to use the term pro-violent. So, pro-violent actors, pro-violent maybe Islamic rhetoric. So that's more to the point, and those do need to be encountered one way or another. Otherwise, if you keep using the term extremist or radical, those are largely political terms, and people tend to use those terms according to their interest. So if you're the largest player, the biggest, strongest player, you are going to label you know, whoever's encountering you as radical. Radical according to what? Extreme according to what? So these are all like standards. And we find that in his language as well, unfortunately, I have to say. And if I may, if I just quote him, and here comes a quotation, radical Islam's ideology is a grave threat to all civilized people. Again, here you see on the one hand the civilized, apparently. I think he is putting himself there, obviously. Then the radical Islam's ideology. So that language, that dichotomy is again coming up from his language. That's very unfortunate. I have to say that, for instance, former national security advisor during the Obama regime, for instance, was a scholar. His name, Quentin Viktorovitz, and he's actually the one who really knows a lot, for instance, about the Salafist ideology. He has come up with categories to talk about the Salafist movement in general. So very nuanced language. Here, unfortunately, we don't find that in his language. You know, of course, he's better than the language that Trump uses, but then again, I think there are many people who would be doing a much better job than what Trump is doing.
So, you've touched upon different adjectives and concepts involving Islamism and Islamic ideology, and let's continue focusing on that a little bit now. So McMaster's comments perhaps give the impression that the US's fight against radical Islamic terrorism may now be shifting to a fight against political Islam on its own. And the notion of political Islam once received substantial praise from the US due to its moderate character. Would you agree with this kind of a view?
Right. Not only in terms of political Islam, but other types of Islamic groups as well. When, especially in the 1990s, there was this fury about promoting civil society as a sphere where all kinds of, let's say, groups, excluded groups, can organize themselves and promote their ideas, including the Islamist or the political Islamist movement. It was promoted with the idea that in time these groups will learn and internalize the rules of the democratic game, internalize pluralism, internalize the rule of law, and so on and so forth. Now, the challenge with especially the political Islamism, but other groups of other Islamic groups as well, is that what happens when you actually get the power? So that's where the real challenge begins. Now, in Tunisia, for instance, the political Islamist actors have indeed shared the power. Now, we didn't see that in Egypt, unfortunately. Maybe to an extent it was, others would agree there is some room for debate there. Nevertheless, it seems like they are taking those examples into account, and even maybe putting other political parties as well in this grouping. Thus, these kinds of comments as they raise. So, yeah, they do see political Islam as these movements that have started out in the civil society, and now that the fact that they have come to power and maybe they haven't quite mastered, let's put it from their perspective, from the perspective of McMasters, they haven't quite mastered the rules of the game yet, or quite fully, and that's the sort of criticism, if you will, that they're raising against. I wouldn't agree with the fact that, you know, necessarily all grassroots Islamic movements would go this direction. Having said that, indeed, not all groups who start their lives in civil society should be seen as angels of peace, if I may say so.
You've talked about Tunisia, you've talked about Egypt as examples, and let's now come to Turkey. There's actually a particular emphasis on Turkey's ruling Justice and Development Party in McMaster's comments, and he gives the example of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey as an example of radical ideologies bridging into political Islam. So is this bad news for the AKP, and how seriously should these remarks be received by Turkey's government?
Right. At the beginning, we mentioned how an important figure this general is as the National Security Advisor. And this is a high-level event. It is a public event. And it just comes days before Donald Trump's announcement, about the national security strategy. So certainly it should be taken very seriously. And the fact that he has pointed out, Justice Development Party is an important issue. Clearly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs here has already responded, an initial comment, rejecting all these accusations and so on and so forth. It clearly shows that it has to be taken very seriously. But the real extent, and what should be done about it, all the details, if you will, I think will come definitely much stronger after Monday. Because we want to see what kind of details will come out after the overall strategy is laid out on Monday. But this is definitely not a good sign.
Mm-hmm. So finally, my final question to you is, do McMaster's comments perhaps hint at the end of the Greater Middle Eastern Initiative, which was quite a popular idea throughout the 2000s, and it was popularly championed by the US?
That's true. The idea, in order to, let's say, democratize, in quotations, let's say, the Middle East, was one of the projects. And these are, of course, different sort of ideas people use, especially the big players use, let's say, to increase their influence. I mean, there's no doubt about that. This could be Russia as well, right? Whenever they come to Syria, they say, we're bringing peace. Everybody wants to, at least in terms of the rhetoric, bringing peace and democracy. Now, what they actually do, or whether they intend to do, what are the consequences of what they have done, is a whole other deal. So I'm not even sure whether any political actor, presumably as rational and as powerful as the U.S., had really the intentions of bringing or doing something in terms of democratizing the Middle East. Because what we have truly seen is that if you look at the early stages of what's called as the Arab Spring, it was really a demand for democracy coming from below and not from top, and definitely not from outside. So I think that if there were a project of Greater Middle East, meaning to bring democracy to the Middle East, I think it never was realized. And in that sense, it didn't even end, because it never really began. But the issue of big players trying to increase their influence in the Middle East, that's going to continue. Obviously, the oil is an important commodity for all the big players, and it has become, very unfortunately, the Middle East has become an area where the big players, especially Russia and certainly the US, are displaying their power as an arena to show how influential they are or how powerful they are to the rest of the world. So this is definitely not good news for the local actors. We definitely have to take these comments very seriously as as people who live in this part of the world. And unfortunately, what Trump is often expressing more crudely is coming out of McMaster's mouth, maybe slightly more nuanced, but with a lot of bad news for the whole area, and unfortunately for Turkey as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yükleyen, for your comments and for being with us in the studio tonight.
It's my pleasure.
We'll continue with our next news video. Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Ankara on Monday to hold talks with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This was the third meeting of the two leaders in a month.
Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Ankara on Monday to hold talks with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In their third meeting in a month, Erdogan and Putin focused on a number of issues, including the situation around the status of Jerusalem, the peace process in Syria, the fight against terrorism, and Russian-Turkish cooperation. After the 2-hour meeting, Putin told journalists that he had discussed possible convening of a Syrian National Dialogue Congress in early 2018 with Syrian President Bashar Assad earlier in the day. We are conducting joint work to prepare and convene the Syrian National Dialogue Congress at the beginning of the next year. It is a secret to no one that I spoke about it with President Assad during today's visit to Syria, Putin said. Speaking alongside Erdogan in a press conference after the meeting, Putin said that Russia and Turkey agree that the United States' decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital has a destabilizing effect on the situation in the region. Both Russia and Turkey believe that the decision of the United States administration to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and move its embassy to that city in no way promotes the settlement of the situation in the Middle East. On the contrary, it destabilizes the situation in the region, which is already tense, Putin said. The Russian leader said that Erdogan had informed him about preparations for a summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, which was later held in Istanbul on Wednesday. Naturally, as an observer country in this organization, Russia will be represented at this forum, Putin noted. Meanwhile, Erdogan said he was pleased by Putin's stand and condemned Israel over the deaths of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. Erdogan added that the OIC summit would be a turning point on the crisis and that Russia had promised to send a representative. Putin thanked Erdogan for an open and constructive dialogue. We are determined to continue to develop cooperation between our countries on the basis of principles of good neighborly relations and respect of each other's interests, the Russian president added.
The trial against former Halkbank executive Mehmet Hakan Atilla continues in New York.
The trial against Turkish banker Hakan Atilla, widely known as the Atilla case, is proceeding. However, the last witness the prosecutors called to the stand, Hüseyin Korkmaz, caused controversy due to his alleged ties with the FETÖ organization. Korkmaz, a fugitive former Turkish police investigator, testified that Halkbank's general manager Süleyman Aslan took bribes from Zarrab. Korkmaz said he fled Turkey and took with him evidence from the investigation, which he turned over to the US authorities. Under questioning by Assistant US Attorney Michael Lockhart, Korkmaz said that Atilla was among the Halkbank executives who were under investigation in the Turkish case. However, Atilla wasn't charged in that case. Furthermore, Korkmaz denied questions by Attila's lawyers seeking to link him to Fethullah Gülen, who is believed to be the mastermind of the 2016 failed coup attempt in Turkey. Yet, Hakan Attila's lawyers targeted Korkmaz for testifying about the 2013 Turkish investigation in ways they say violated US trial rules and unfairly prejudiced the jury against their client. The lawyers asked the judge to declare a mistrial, saying testimony by a former Turkish police officer should not have been allowed in court. The repeated testimony implicating high-level officials in Turkey based on hearsay evidence is inappropriate on many levels, Attila's lawyers said in a letter to the US District Judge Richard Berman. Moreover, in his testimony, Korkmaz revealed that he was paid $50,000 by the FBI, testifying at an ongoing trial over violating US sanctions on Iran. Shortly after the testimony, the Turkey mission chief of the FBI was called to the Ankara Police Department. The nature of this meeting has not been publicized. Meanwhile, following Korkmaz's testimony, the prosecutors announced that they had finished presenting their case. One of Attila's lawyers told US District Judge Richard Berman that Attila would testify next. Attila was expected to take the stand after lunch on Thursday. However, the lawyers for both sides were unable to resolve disputes over evidence the government seeks to introduce before resting its case against him. Attila's lawyers told the judge that they plan to present 3 or 4 witnesses in addition to their client.
The Organization of Islamic Cooperation held an extraordinary summit in Istanbul on Wednesday, following US President Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
The 57-member Organization of Islamic Cooperation held an extraordinary summit in Istanbul on Wednesday after the US recognition of Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. The Istanbul summit brought together kings and heads of states and governments from all member countries except Syria. Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, Qatari Emir Al Thani, and Jordanian King Abdullah II were among the most prominent leaders present at the summit. Saudi Arabia was represented by the country's Islamic Affairs Minister. Iranian President Rouhani, on the other hand, came to Istanbul one day before the summit to hold meetings with the officials. In the summit, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation recognized East Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Palestine and invited other countries to follow suit. We declare East Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Palestine and invite all countries to recognize the State of Palestine and East Jerusalem as its occupied capital, read the final communique released after the OIC summit in Istanbul, chaired by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the current OIC term president. The 23-article Istanbul Declaration expressed full solidarity with Palestine and rejected and condemned in the strongest terms the unilateral decision by the President of the United States of America recognizing Al-Quds as the so-called capital of Israel. Trump's move is an attack on the historical, legal, natural and national rights of the Palestinian people, a deliberate undermining of all peace efforts, a move to extremism and terrorism, and a threat to international peace and security, read the communique. In his opening remarks, Erdogan also slammed the US decision and the Israeli government's actions, saying, "Jerusalem is and always will be the capital of Palestine. I invite countries that claim international law and equity to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Palestinian state under occupation."
Turkish football team Beşiktaş was drawn against Bayern Munich in the UEFA Champions League last 16.
Turkish champion Beşiktaş was being drawn against Bayern Munich on Monday in the Champions League last 16. Beşiktaş will play the first leg in Munich on February 20, 2018, while the second one is scheduled to be played in Istanbul on March 14th. Beşiktaş chairman Fikret Orman said that there was no easy draw at this stage of the tournament. "The opponent is strong, but we are not a weak team. We will do our best and we will make the best use of the time we have until the first game," Orman said. The Bayern sporting director said that the Germans will not be underestimating Beşiktaş either, knowing how strong it can be. "It will be a difficult task, but we are looking forward to the unusual atmosphere in their stadium. One always says it is a disadvantage to play at home in the first leg, but we are strong enough to accept that and we will give our all," he added.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
The Performing Arts Center has introduced a new festival to music lovers last season. Mix Festival brings together different genres of music under the same roof tonight and tomorrow. This year, both international and local music scenes will perform at Mix Festival. A prominent figure of Turkish folk music and psychedelic rock, Sağda Bağcan, Ali Farka Ture Band, and Terrakaft, which combine traditional Malian music with New World blues. The French band Electro Deluxe, that brings acid jazz and funk together with hip-hop and new jazz. English indie rock band The Wedding Present, Cem Adrian, Jacques, Goose, Mustafa Özkent, Kabus Kerim, Manuş Baba, Slam, Jacuzzi, The Away Days are among the names to play at Mix Festival. The festival program will expand to all stages. Leonardo da Vinci Expo. A Genius in Istanbul exhibition is on at Unique Museum. Considered as the most important exhibition dedicated to Leonardo da Vinci, this international exhibition is in Istanbul as part of a world tour after the premiere of Bruges. In addition to 100 sketches, paintings, writings, and original works of art, 100 replicas created from Da Vinci's original sketches will also be exhibited at the Unique Istanbul.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.